Forward Operating Base Blackthorn looked like it had been dropped from the sky and left to bake in the dust. The desert stretched in every direction, a bleached and endless expanse that swallowed sound and color alike. Rows of sandbag walls stood like tired sentries around the perimeter, broken only by jagged barriers of Hesco and the gleam of concertina wire. Heat shimmered off the metal roofs of prefab huts, and somewhere beyond the motor pool, the generators groaned under the weight of the day's work. Kayla Vance moved steadily along the gravel path toward the supply tent, the weight of a wooden ammunition crate biting into her palms. She didn't hurry. Out here, rushing in the heat only made the work harder. Sweat had long since soaked the back of her plain, unadorned fatigues. No patches. No rank. Not even a name tape. She was just another pair of hands among the dozens that kept the war machine turning. One of the logistics ghosts who counted bullets, shuffled boxes, and fixed gear without ever earning a nod of recognition. At the heart of the base, soldiers were preparing for something bigger than the usual patrols. A ripple of urgency ran through the air, clipped orders, sharper voices, tighter knots of personnel around map tables. Kayla caught the edge of their tension without letting her gaze linger. Her job was to move ammo from the last helicopter drop to the armory tent. Everything else was noise. Near the main staging area, Master Sergeant Nathan Mason was already in full stride, a stack of maps tucked under one arm as he barked instructions to the six-man fire team shadowing him. He cut the figure of a man carved from oak, square-shouldered, sun-creased face, every step brimming with purpose. The kind of NCO who could strip paint with his voice alone. "This isn't a dry run, people," Mason growled as they passed the supply lane. 3 civilians. 72 hours before Rourke's men decide they're more useful as corpses. "We move light, we move fast, and we do not get spotted." Kayla slid the crate onto a stack beside the tent flap just as Mason reversed a step, checking something on his map. His boot nearly caught the edge of her loadout. He jerked back, then turned on her like she tripped a tripwire. "Watch where you drop your gear, Supply," he snapped, not even meeting her eyes. "Some of us have real work to do." She said nothing. Not a twitch in her expression. Not a flicker in her pace. She simply shifted the crate half an inch, stacked the next one, and moved on. It was easier when they didn't notice her. In fact, it was part of the plan. No one at Blackthorn had asked her name since she'd arrived 3 days ago. That suited her just fine. The sun was a hammer overhead by the time she returned from the drop zone with her second load. Around her, the hum of preparation sharpened. Rifles laid out on canvas mats, medics checking trauma kits, comms text testing, encrypted headsets. She wove through them without disrupting the flow, heading for the shade of the supply tent. From inside came the tinny echo of the radio net. Intel chatter, convoy status reports, weather updates. And between them, the low growl of Mason's voice carrying across the compound. He was briefing again, this time on infiltration routes, his words edged with impatience. Kayla set down her load and knelt to repack a row of 5.56 millimeters in waterproof sleeves. The movements were mechanical, practiced, the kind you could perform blindfolded. She didn't look up when Mason's voice drew closer, or when a cluster of boots halted just beyond her work area. "Western approach puts us inside the target grid without crossing open flats," Mason was saying. "That's the priority path unless intel changes." His shadow slid over her hands as he stepped backward, then stopped. For half a second, Kayla felt his gaze on her. Not the glance of a man annoyed at a supply clerk in his way, but something sharper. Searching. It passed quickly. He moved on with his briefing, and she kept her head down, sealing each ammo pack in its sleeve. But she'd seen the moment his attention had snagged, not on her face, but near her collar where the fabric had shifted. She adjusted the neckline before lifting the next crate. The rest of the morning dissolved into heat and repetition. Hauling, sorting, counting, checking. Occasionally, someone from one of the squads drifted close enough for idle talk, but the conversation was always between soldiers. She was furniture in their peripheral vision, a fixture in the background. That was fine. It let her listen. She caught snatches, changes in the hostage location, debate over approach vectors, the name of a village 2 ridges south. Each fragment lodged in her memory, tucked away with others. She built the picture quietly, without pen or paper, without breaking the rhythm of her hands. Once, a group of younger privates near the water station caught sight of her passing with another load. One of them, a blond kid whose boots still looked factory new, smirked at his friends and stepped right into her path. His shoulder clipped hers, and the corner of the crate tilted just enough for several small boxes to spill into the dirt. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Careful, supply girl. Wouldn't want the important people to trip." The laughter from his friends was the brittle kind that liked an audience. Kayla crouched to gather the scattered rounds, her motions steady, deliberate. She neither looked up nor offered a single word in reply. "What's wrong with her?" one muttered. "Who cares?" the blonde kid said. "She's just here to count bullets while we do the real work." By the time they lost interest and wandered away, the last box was back in place. She rose, balanced the crate on her hip, and continued to the tent. The collar of her fatigues had shifted again during the bump, just enough for a sliver of dark crimson to show, threaded through with black. No one had noticed. Not yet. At midday, the base seemed to hold its breath. Heat shimmered above the runway where a helicopter's rotors wound down, delivering the final supply drop before the mission launch. Kayla worked through the offload with 2 other logistics hands, but their small talk washed over her unheard. Her attention was fixed elsewhere, on the soundscape of the compound, on who was moving where, on which conversations carried a note of uncertainty. Every detail mattered, the kind of details no one bothered to hide from the woman they thought was invisible. By the time she returned to the armory tent, her hands were dusty and her shoulders ached from the weight of the crates. None of it showed in her stride. She placed the last load on the pallet and moved to the back, where the shadows were deep enough to hide the smallest expression. From there, she could see Mason passing through the compound again, speaking to a comms tech. And she could see the moment his eyes cut her way for the second time that day. Brief, but sharper now, as if he'd caught the edge of something he couldn't name. Kayla looked back down at the round she was packing. Her hands moved without hesitation. No one had asked her name in 3 days. But now, someone had started to notice. Afternoon scorched the base into a haze, the kind that made distance bend and edges soften. Heat wrapped the tents like a fist. Sweat collected along Kayla's hairline and never bothered to fall. She crossed the gravel again with a clipboard tucked under one arm, the other hand steadying a crate as though it were a sleeping animal. Inside the admin prefab, an oscillating fan pushed warm air from one side of the room to the other, achieving nothing but the illusion of mercy. Lieutenant Mara Arlen stood over a table strewn with laminated maps, and a tablet she stabbed at like it had personally failed her. She was all elegant sharpness, regulation bun, precise creases, a thin vein pulsing at her temple. 2 comms specialists hovered nearby, murmuring about interference on the Western relay. Kayla waited at the threshold until the conversation dipped. "Requesting access to the weapons cage for verification," she said, voice level. "Inventory check before deployment." Arlen didn't look up. "Denied. We're in the final phase of prep. Standard procedure requires." "I know the procedures." Arlen's eyes lifted, cool and irritated. "You'll get your inventory after we roll. We don't have the bandwidth to shepherd logistics through their paperwork right now." Kayla nodded once. She didn't argue, didn't flinch, didn't try to sell the logic of catching small mistakes before they metastasized. She simply stood in the hum of electronics and traced the map with her eyes. The ridgeline, the saddle, the dry wash that looked friendly until you understood how sound traveled there. The route into the valley marked with a thin, confident line. "Close that door on your way out," Arlen said. Kayla did. Outside, the light hit her like a wall. The air smelled of hot rubber and the faint sweetness of diesel tabs dissolving in fuel. She cut across toward the communications tent under a frayed shade cloth. Techs hunched over consoles inside, headphones on, faces painted by flickering screens. A young sergeant ran a fingertip along a waveform and frowned. Western approach still reads clean, he told his chief. Traffic's migrating south. Almost like they're clearing the lane. Almost like makes my teeth itch, the chief muttered. Flag it for ops, but don't spook anyone yet. Kayla shelved a box of spare batteries on the metal rack beside them. Her movement didn't disturb the rhythm of the room. No one lowered their voice because a supply clerk was within earshot. That was the magic of being unimportant. You could hear almost everything. Back in the supply lane, two privates loitered near the water buffalo, trading jokes at a volume calibrated for witnesses. One, the blonde with the fresh boots, had invented a swagger in the last hour. He flicked his chin toward Kayla as she approached with a stack of sealed magazines. Hey, watch this, he whispered to his buddy. He stepped into her path again, casual as a stray thought. The magazines tilted. One slid, bumped her forearm, clattered to the gravel and popped open, cartridges skittering like beetles. The blonde grinned. Careful there, supply. Wouldn't want anyone vital tripping. His friend laughed. It was a thin sound, all surface. Kayla knelt without comment. She collected each round with the same attention she would have given a glass instrument, pressing them into their cradle with a soft click. The blonde waited for a flare of anger, or at least the fracture of patience. He got silence. What's her deal? The friend said, quieter this time. Drone, the blonde decided. Counts bullets. That's her deal. Kayla slid the last cartridge home, closed the lid, and rose. The motion lifted her collar, just enough for a sliver of deep red to show, threaded black, like a scar healed over. Sun bounced off brass. The two privates didn't notice. She adjusted the fabric and walked on. At the armory tent, she built order out of other people's haste. One row for 5.56 linked, one for loose. 7.62 by belt length, grenades by fuse type. Subsonics separated from frangibles. Breaching rounds flagged with tape. Each placement told a story. How heavy someone expected the fight to be, where silence would matter, what problems they thought they'd solve with explosives. She wrote those stories inwardly, the way a cartographer marks rivers no one else believes exist. Mason's voice cut across the compound like a serrated blade. He argued with Arlen near the tactical board, his hands drawing lines in the air that weren't on her map. The valley is a throat, he said. You put a team in there. You accept that whoever holds the windpipe decides when you breathe. Arlen tapped the tablet. Satellite imagery shows minimal activity on the western lip. We exploit what we're given. Minimal activity where they know we're staring. Mason shot back. Which is their reminder that we're predictable. Kayla placed a strip of chem lights beside a bundle of zip cuffs and listened without moving her head. The argument pinged between them, protocol versus instinct, both backed by years that had taught different lessons. She could feel the moment Mason's gaze drifted and caught on her again, not the person, but the angle of her collar. She kept her eyes on the table. Vance, Arlen called suddenly. Kayla turned neutral. Where are my SFMBs? Arlen asked. We requisitioned 3. Arrived on the last bird, Kayla said. Coded and staged. Good, Arlen said, like a point had been proven. Mason didn't speak. He just watched. Something had shifted in his expression. Curiosity edged with caution. That look didn't belong to a man assessing a supply clerk's competence. It belonged to someone peering through brush and thinking, there's a shape in there. The rest of the afternoon unspooled in small reels. Blades thumping, straps ratcheting down, metal on metal. Kayla moved through it like a slow river, carrying what needed carrying, setting down what needed setting down. She drifted past clusters of soldiers trading intel and superstition, stitched details into a tapestry nobody else was weaving. The pattern resolved and sharpened. A valley that was too quiet, a ridge with the wrong kind of erosion, a shepherd's path that didn't show on satellite because goats weren't in the algorithm. At 1600, the base's sound narrowed to a knife point. Everyone was inside their task. Even the flies seemed to keep their distance. Kayla stepped into the shade of the tactical tent with another case, loose 9mm, subsonic. She placed it near the edge, within reach and out of the way, invisible and exactly where it would be needed if someone understood the night correctly. A shadow fell across her hands. Mason stood there, angle of his body suggesting he'd come to retrieve something else and arrived at a different decision. "You," he said not unkindly. Kayla straightened. "You've been on base 3 days?" he asked, like the answer mattered less than how she chose to give it. "Yes, Sergeant." "From where?" "Joint Logistics," she said. Accurate enough to satisfy a form. Mason's mouth tilted, not into a smile. "Uh-huh." His eyes lowered collar, throat, then returned to her face. "Watch your placement," he said, but the words had softened into something else. Not a rebuke so much as a ritual phrase offered to preserve the shape of things. He moved off without what he'd come for. The sun sagged toward the ridgeline. Shadows lengthened, crept into places heat had ruled all day. Kayla stacked her final loadout and checked each label twice. She had no expectation of thanks. Recognition was a cost, not a reward. The private with the fresh boots reappeared at the edge of the armory, hands jammed into his pockets. Maybe guilt had nibbled at him. Or maybe he wanted another push to entertain the fear braided tight in his chest. "Hey, he began, searching for a casual tone and finding none. "You missed a box back by the pallets." Kayla looked at him. The kid flinched under the quiet. "I'll get it," she said. He shifted his weight. "Look, about earlier." "Work on your timing," she said, not unkindly. "And your situational awareness." He blinked. "My what?" "Noticing things before they matter," Kayla said. "It's cheaper that way." His mouth worked around that for a second. "Right. Yeah." He backed away, relieved to have been dismissed without blood. When he was gone, Kayla lifted the lapel of her fatigues and checked the stitch that hid the patch. The red was there, a dark petal, the black threads neat as a vow. She pressed the fabric flat. The fold had held for years. It would hold for years more. Across the yard, the colonel arrived without ceremony, moving like a weather system that had changed its mind. Conversations shifted direction as he passed. He paused near the map table, took the valley route with a professional stillness that said he'd already argued it out in his head. His gaze drifted, calibrated the tent, landed on Kayla for one heartbeat too long. There it was again, a seam pulling, a puzzle reaching for its missing piece. He spoke quietly to Mason. Mason glanced at Kayla. They stepped away together to the corner of the tent where the canvas hung softer and the light went amber. Their voices dropped. Arlen watched, chin up, expression neutral in a way that made neutrality into a weapon. Kayla completed her last count. She chalked a discreet mark on the crate stack that would mean nothing to anyone else. Ready, calibrated, clean. At the edge of the tent, the comms chief ducked in and reported the same lie the satellites had been telling for hours. "Western corridor's light," he said. "Could be our best shot." Could be, Kayla thought. Or could be a hand at the small of your back, guiding you toward a door that wasn't a door at all. Patterns were easy once you knew where to look. The trick was teaching your eyes to care about what didn't wave its arms. She slid the clipboard onto a shelf and stepped into the threshold of the tactical tent just as Mason returned from his huddle with the colonel. He didn't stop this time. He didn't need to. The new attention in his face said enough. "Final briefing in 20, he called to the room. "Come with questions, leave with a plan." People moved. Chairs scraped. The map lights glowed a deeper red, like the color of an old brand. Kayla stood still for one breath, then another. Patterns weren't just in the terrain or the chatter. They lived in the way a base inhaled before a mission, in who stared a fraction too long, in which rules bent and which snapped. She felt the picture set in her bones, as inevitable as dusk. When the colonel's gaze found her again, it didn't slide off. It landed. It stayed. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackthorn, someone important looked at the invisible worker and saw more than a pair of hands. The first thing Kayla noticed was how the light inside the command tent didn't quite match the hour outside. It was too low, too warm, like the inside of a lantern before dawn. That meant the senior staff had been here for a while, shuffling plans, reviewing feeds, wearing their tension into the canvas. She stepped in with a box of breaching charges hugged against her ribs. The air smelled faintly of paper dust and heat baked out of nylon maps. Colonel Stroud stood near the tactical table, one gloved hand resting on the edge. His weathered face betrayed nothing, but his eyes moved in precise cuts, like a blade that knew where it was going before it moved. Those eyes found her almost at once. For a second, there was no one else in the tent. Then Stroud's voice came, level, as if he were asking about the weather. "Mason, a word." The master sergeant peeled away from the cluster of operators he'd been briefing. Kayla kept her gaze down, setting the charges where they belonged. But she didn't need to look to know the two men had moved into the far corner of the tent. From there, they had a clean sight line on her. Their conversation was too low to catch, but the rhythm said plenty. A short burst from the colonel, a longer answer from Mason, then silence long enough to weigh something fragile. Both glanced her way again. She checked the placement of the detonator caps, aware that Lieutenant Arlen had noticed the exchange. The lieutenant's brows were drawn, her eyes flitting between Kayla and the two senior men like she was trying to guess which one had crossed the line. Arlen finally stepped over, clipboard in hand. Her voice clipped enough to cut cloth. "Your file says you arrived 3 days ago," she said without preamble. "Previous assignment not listed." Kayla didn't look up. "Joint Logistics Support, ma'am. I go where ordnance is needed." "That's vague," Arlen pressed. "Which command sent you?" "I believe those details are in my transfer orders," Kayla replied, her tone mild. "I'll be checking." Arlen's gaze lingered, searching for a twitch or a giveaway. Finding none, she moved off toward the comm station. From the corner of the tent, Mason's voice cut across. "Mercer." Private Mercer, tall, restless, the one with the cocky smirk, looked up from leaning on a crate of grenades. "Yes, Sergeant." "Show some respect," Mason said flatly. Mercer frowned. "For the supply girl?" "Now," Mason said, with a tone that didn't invite a second question. Mercer backed off, confusion flickering through his expression before he turned away. When the others cleared out, Mason crossed the floor toward Kayla. His approach was slower than usual, as if measuring each step. "Where'd you get that patch?" he asked quietly. Kayla kept her hands on the foam-lined case she was organizing. "What patch?" "Don't," Mason said. His voice wasn't hard this time, more like someone asking about a shadow they'd seen in a locked room. "Red with black stitching. Inside your collar." She didn't answer. "I've heard the stories," Mason went on. "Echo Red, operators who don't exist on any roster. Ghost missions. People say it's just to spook the rookies." He hesitated. Then, "But I've never seen one of their patches before." Kayla shut the case and latched it. "Is there something you need for the mission, Sergeant?" Before he could respond, the tent flap lifted. Colonel Stroud stepped back in, 2 security officers in his wake. He didn't look at them when he spoke. "The current plan puts your team through the western approach," he said to Mason. Then his eyes shifted to Kayla. "Specialist, you have thoughts?" The room stilled. "It's a kill box," Kayla said. Her voice was quiet, but the way she said it carried through the tent. "They want you to take that route. Snipers on the ridges. Heavy weapons in the choke." Stroud's expression didn't change. "Explain." Kayla reached into her cargo pocket and unfolded a weathered map, setting it on the nearest crate. Her finger traced a line across the topography, marking 3 points with the same certainty she might have used to note the positions of her own boots. "Secondary tunnel system. Here, here, and here. They've been moving hostages through it for years. Satellite imagery shows the western approach as empty because they've staged elsewhere to bait you." Arlen had reappeared at the entrance. "And how exactly would you know this?" Stroud's eyes stayed on Kayla. "How many missions, operator?" Kayla met his gaze for the first time. 47. The colonel gave a slow nod. "This would be 48 then." Even Mason, who rarely looked surprised, lost a little color at that. Arlen's mouth shut without her meaning it to. The hum of the generator outside filled the gap until Kayla reached up and turned her collar down, revealing the crimson patch fully. Black thread formed a symbol that carried more weight in this tent than any rank insignia. Echo Red. The colonel didn't waste a beat. "Mission briefing in 10. Operator Vance will lead." "With respect, sir," Arlen began, "I've been planning." "She's not logistics," Stroud cut her off. Her intel takes priority over all other sources. His voice carried the authority of someone who didn't have to explain why. 47 missions. 0 failures. Kayla began gathering the map and equipment. Around her, the base seemed to tilt on its axis. The same soldiers who'd ignored her that morning now followed her movements like they'd been waiting for orders all along. And Mason? He just watched her with a new kind of focus, like someone who'd been handed the missing piece of a puzzle, and realized the picture was bigger than they'd guessed. The lantern light of the tent seemed warmer now, but the air felt sharper. In 10 minutes, she'd be standing at the center of the room, and they'd all be listening. The command tent was different now. Not in shape, not in structure. Same canvas walls, same scuff tables, same smell of dust and burnt coffee, but in current. The air inside carried a new charge, the kind that shifts a room before a word is spoken. Kayla stood at the center of it, one hand on the map table. Around her, soldiers who'd barely looked her way all week leaned forward, eyes on her as though she'd been there the whole time and they were only now seeing her. The crimson patch at her collar was uncovered. It didn't need introduction. Echo Red spoke for itself. She pointed at the map with a gloved fingertip. "The western corridor is bait," she said, voice steady, measured. 2 ridges, north and south. Both have firing positions with clear angles on your approach. They've pre-sighted those ranges. First team through would be cut to pieces before they hit the choke point. Her fingers slid across the topographic lines to the north. "Instead, we come in along the ridge spine here. It's slower, but you're above their sight lines, using terrain for cover. For clicks from the objective. The entrance to their tunnel system is here, concealed under this rock formation." A murmur ran through the operators ringed around her. Mason leaned in, arms folded, studying the route. "You've used that approach before?" 3 times, Kayla said. 2 successful extractions, 1 sabotage op. It gets you within 500 meters of their main camp before they know you're there. Lieutenant Arlen opened her mouth, but Colonel Stroud's hand came up. "Continue." "They expect a helicopter insertion," Kayla said. "Circling an LZ marked on the south edge. They've set heavy machine guns to cover it. Avoid the airdrop entirely. Moving on foot, split into 2 fire teams, 1 for the tunnels, 1 to intercept if they try to pull the hostages deeper." A comms specialist at the far side of the table raised a hand. "Estimated response time once contact is made." 12 minutes for reinforcements from their southern outpost, Kayla answered without hesitation. "Less if they've got a fast vehicle staged." "That's your clock." Mason's brow furrowed. "How do you know they'll respond from the south?" "They've got no permanent force in the east. Terrain's too exposed, no water source. North is minefields, they won't risk it. South's the only move left." She said it like she'd lived in the camp for months. The colonel's voice broke the moment. "You'll move at 0400. Teams will be assigned per Operator Vance's recommendations." And just like that, the base pivoted. The previous plan, the one that had been polished for days, was swept aside. Maps were redrawn, equipment reallocated, comms frequencies reassigned. Soldiers moved faster, sharper. They no longer looked through Kayla when she passed. They stepped out of her way. They addressed her directly. Some stood a little straighter. Outside the tent, the desert was cooling, a thin wind lifting dust across the parade square. Mason caught up to her near the ammo depot. "You've been planning this since you arrived," he said, not a question. "I arrived when I needed to," Kayla replied, eyes scanning a checklist clipped to her board. Mason studied her a beat longer. "Those aid workers, there's more to them, isn't there? Everyone in that compound needs to come home," she said. "That's all you need to know." Mason didn't push. Not now. But she saw the question settle behind his eyes. Private Mercer approached next, his steps uneven with hesitation. He held out the gloves he'd taken from her earlier in the week. "I'm sorry," he said, awkward. "Didn't know who you were." Kayla slid the gloves back on, tightening the wrist straps. "You've got good instincts, Private. Work on your situational awareness. Missing details in the field gets people killed." "Yes, ma'am." "Operator." "Ma'am," Mercer stammered. By midnight, The base had been reshaped to fit her plan. The motor pool hummed with low-light activity, vehicles prepped, fuel topped, gear lashed down. Weapons were cleaned in silence, optics double-checked. Kayla walked the staging area like she was taking the measure of a weapon before firing. She adjusted the placement of breaching charges, swapped the order of gear in a medic's pack, shifted the timing of a comms relay by 30 seconds. No one argued. Mason found her at the edge of the landing zone where the helicopters sat in shadow, blades tied down. "I've served 20 years, he said quietly. "Never met an Echo Red operator before. Thought you were myth." "That's the point," Kayla said. Mason shook his head. "Guess we're lucky you're real." At 0400, the base was dark but for the faint red of the flight line markers. Soldiers moved toward the helos in a steady flow, every one of them carrying the stillness that comes before the drop. Kayla boarded the lead bird, strapping in without flourish. The patch on her collar caught the light from the open ramp, deep crimson, black-stitched. Mason stepped in after her, securing the hatch. The rotors wound up. The world contracted to the smell of fuel and the steady thump of blades. For the first time in 3 days, no one mistook her for a supply clerk. The helicopters came in low, the blades kicking up waves of dust that rolled across the compound like surf. Even before the skids touched down, the medics were moving, ducking under the rotor wash toward the side doors. 3 civilians stepped out, faces pale, eyes rimmed red from sleepless days. Alive. All of them. Behind them came the assault teams, gear dusty, movements efficient, no one speaking above the engine noise. Kayla was the second to last off the lead bird. Her fatigues were streaked with grit. Her gloves darkened with the residue of rock dust and gun oil. She walked straight past the gathered soldiers and headed for the ammo depot. Within minutes, she was stacking unused ordnance back into its crates, same as she had 3 days ago before anyone had bothered to remember her face. The air in the depot was cooler than outside, but the desert heat still radiated through the canvas. Only now, soldiers who passed her on the way to their own duties gave a nod or a quiet ma'am. They didn't linger, didn't ask questions. Respect didn't need volume. Mason appeared first, carrying 2 steaming mugs. He set one beside her without ceremony. Black. No sugar. Figured that's your style. Kayla took it with a small nod. "Thank you, Sergeant." "That tunnel system," Mason said after a moment, "wasn't on any of our maps. Not even the black files." "No," she said simply. "It wouldn't be." He studied her for a moment. "You've been in this region before." "Several times." The answer hung there, obvious in its implication. Missions no one here would ever read about. Mason took a sip from his mug. "The way you handled that ambush point 3 shooters down before the rest of us even knew they were there." "The mission was successful," Kayla said, turning back to her count. "That's what matters." Mason let it drop, but his eyes told her he wouldn't forget. Lieutenant Arlen arrived next, her tone stripped to the bite it had carried days earlier. "Operator Vance," she began, "I owe you an apology. I didn't treat you with the respect your position deserves." Kayla looked up from her clipboard. "There's nothing to apologize for. My role requires anonymity." "Still," Arlen said, "I pride myself on reading the people around me. I should have noticed something sooner." "That's the point," Kayla replied. "If you had noticed, I wouldn't be doing my job right." Arlen nodded, chastened. "The colonel says you'll be with us for another week. If you need anything, ask me directly." By early evening, Mercer appeared at the depot with a small group of soldiers. They stopped a few paces away, as if approaching a shrine. "We're heading to the mess to decompress," Mercer said, tentative. "You're welcome to join us." Kayla gave him a faint smile. "I appreciate the invitation, Private, but I still have work here." He nodded quickly. "Of course. Maybe another time." "Resupply bird." "You know," he said, "we have people for that now. You don't need to keep doing it yourself." "I find it useful," Kayla replied. "Routines make you invisible, even when people know who you are." Mason nodded. "The men have been talking. Some are spooked, thinking you were here to evaluate them." "I'm not here to evaluate anyone," she said. "Maybe not," Mason allowed. But the red patch carries weight. Stories. Legends. Most of them exaggerated, she said. Maybe, Mason said. But after seeing you in the field, I'm not so sure. When a new batch of personnel arrived later in the week, one of the fresh-faced specialists saw her stacking crates and snorted. Who's the woman doing grunt work? Mason, overhearing, fixed him with a look sharp enough to strip paint. That, he said, is someone who's saved more lives than you'll ever know. Remember that before you open your mouth again. The kid went pale and nodded. On her final evening at Blackthorn, Kayla stood at the perimeter fence. The sun dipped toward the mountains, the sky bleeding into the same deep crimson as her patch. Stroud joined her for a moment, hands clasped behind his back. Your replacement arrives tomorrow, he said. Logistics only this time. The mission's complete, she confirmed. All objectives achieved. One of those civilians was carrying intel that could have compromised 3 operations, Stroud said. If they'd broken him. They didn't, Kayla said. No, Stroud agreed. Thanks to you. He offered his hand. It's been an honor. She shook it briefly. Likewise, sir. When he left, Kayla stayed at the fence, watching the last light fade. Tomorrow she'd be gone. Another base, another identity, another mission no one would talk about. The crimson patch would be hidden again, just another thread in a uniform seam. And she'd walk back into the shadows, where she belonged. Recognition had never been the goal. The mission was everything. And the mission never ended.